On the one hand, there is this major push to negotiations. It is serious, and there's no doubt that it is happening. Trump, Putin phone calls. We've had diplomats, Witkoff, for example, travel to Russia. But then we have policies announced by the Trump administration sending ground-launched small diameter bombs, long-range weapons, as well as the exemption now on specific energy transactions for Russia, so tightening the screws on sanctions. Marco Rubio was just at the G7. They came up with a statement that Russia will face sanctions if it doesn't accept a ceasefire to this conflict. What do you make of these contradictions?
Well, it's the absence of any kind of strategy in the part of the West. And, the idea that there's some sanctions that they have yet to impose on Russia, that when they impose them, Russians are going to go, oh my God, yeah, we better surrender right away because the West is so strong. It's nonsense. Russia solidified its relationship with China now 3 years ago. And it was in direct response to the Western sanctions where Russia finally realized after years, it's as if Russia was in a relationship with an abusive spouse, that Mother Russia was the wife and the West was the drunken wife beater. And by God, man, we kept smacking her around for years. We kept coming home drunk, kept throwing up on the carpet. And Russia still managed to put up with it until February of 2022, when Putin recognized, this is going to stop. And even then, I think Putin held out hope that by starting the special military operation, it would force the West to come to their senses. And they were fully prepared. Russia was fully prepared to negotiate a quick end to that special military operation. That they even, and I heard this from Foreign Minister Lavrov on Monday, where he said, look, the deal that we signed off on in Istanbul in April of 2022, that came from the Ukrainians. So the Russians were willing even to accept a Ukrainian proposal to bring an end to that conflict. And what happened? It was blown up by the West. So from that point on, Russia's realized there's no relationship with the West. They can come back and promise, honey, I'm never going to do it again. Honey, I'm going to go see a therapist. Honey, I'm going to attend Alcoholics Anonymous. That's all over. This relationship is broken in terms of the dependence that once existed. Russia would be willing to deal with the West, but it's going to be dealing with the West at arm's length distance, where it's not going to be dependent upon Western banking systems. It's not going to be dependent upon Western currency. It's not going to allow itself to be in a position where Western sanctions can cripple or hurt Russia. Russia's it's got the resources, it's got the wealth, it's got the technological skill that it doesn't need a single thing that the West has to offer. And in contrast to that, here's the United States wanting to throw around and impose sanctions, yet Russia and China combined control over 90% of the antimony in the world. Antimony is a rare earth mineral, which is a critical, essential component for the production of artillery shells. With that being cut off by Russia and China, the United States doesn't have an alternative to turn to. So they can talk a big game about producing all these artillery shells for Ukraine to use against Russia, but the fact of the matter is they don't have the essential materials needed. So these kinds of threats emanating from Washington and from the G7, for starters, Russia doesn't take Europe seriously at all. They view them as a team of dwarf poodles, little yappy dogs that have no teeth, make a lot of annoying noise, but represent no threat. The United States is in a different category, but there again, the United States is not in a position to coerce or force Russia to do anything. Russia is going to preserve and pursue its own national interests. And the United States will either have to come to recognize and accept that, or pay the price, as Ray referred to, that you can ignore reality, but then at some point you have to. The consequences of ignoring reality are going to hit you.
Right. I definitely want to bring you in here. So what is your take of this moment, and how do these contradictions factor into, because there's a lot of enthusiasm about this peace process. How do they factor into it? What do you make of it?
Well, I think one thing that needs to be mentioned is that Putin himself is under considerable pressure. He has admitted, I was too trusting. I was naive. The promise of not 1 inch east of Eastern Europe for NATO, the business about replacing Yanukovych government in Kiev, all these things, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, and then the Istanbul Accord, where we thought we had a deal. We did have a deal. We had a deal with Zelensky's best buddy, for God's sake. He headed the delegation. And now his best buddy is saying, yeah, we had a deal. I initialed it, but Boris Johnson came in at the behest of the US and the UK and put the kibosh on it. So betrayal is what Putin is aware of, more so his generals and his admirals looking over his shoulder. Vladimir, don't let him take you in again. So does that mean that there's no chance for an agreement on Ukraine? No, it doesn't. I think trust is gone. We can't say doverai no proverai anymore. Trust but verify. How about just agree but verify? Okay. Now you can't tell me that any kind of situation that we worked out, ceasefire or whatever, cannot be effectively verified with the combined means, national technical means, we used to call them, people, the satellites and everything else, of such sophistication that we would know almost immediately about violations of an agreement, not a trust, okay? So it's possible to do that. And what needs to happen is, in my view, the American people need to be educated to the fact that this is the case, that it is history, that this was not unprovoked on the part of Putin. It was provoked, and we have the Secretary General of the NATO admitting that in May of 2023. He said, Putin said, you keep trying to get Ukraine in NATO, we will have to invade. We said no, and so he invaded. I mean, hello, how clear do you need to be? So it was not unprovoked. And the next adjective usually is full scale invasion, right? Full scale. All right. Well, most people think about 90,000 troops that went up there near Kiev, and their purpose was to scare the hell out of Zelensky. Did they do that? Yeah, they did do that. Did Zelensky come to terms? Yeah, he sent his best friends to Istanbul to come to terms. Okay, that's what happened. It was a full-scale invasion. So once the American people realized that not only was it not a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but that the Russians don't want any part of occupying all of Ukraine, that would be crazy. That would be a Vietnam for them. Nor do they want Poland, nor do they want the Baltic states. For God's sake, don't believe people like Biden, who's been told by Blinken and Sullivan to say these things. They're not true. So I look with optimism, and I'm prompted to note that yesterday, the events after Witkoff came back from Moscow were greeted by cautious optimism on the part of Peskov, the presidential spokesman, Putin's spokesman. And Trump said they were productive. So despite all this stuff, despite all this ineptitude on the part of the State Department and NSC and this guy Kellogg, there's communication between Putin and Trump, And that's what's going to solve all this. And as I said before, the kernel is already solved. Once Trump recognizes, as he already did, that Russia's core concerns, national security concerns, existential concerns in Ukraine are the same as ours were in Cuba in 1962. If Trump understands that, then I believe he'll have a willing partner to work out something that allows for properly verified, not trust, but an agreement written on paper, blessed by the UN Security Council if possible, but it doesn't need that. People need to be held accountable. Sophisticated collection of intelligence enables that to happen. That's possible. And I wait in hope that in the next couple of months that will be doable and concluded.
From your understanding of Russia, how have you seen them maneuvering these contradictions of the Trump, I guess you could say, attempt at negotiations? What have you made of how Russia's been dealing with this and how it will move forward given what Ray just said?
Well, first it should be said that the reason why there's some optimism is that the Russians and the Americans appear to want the same thing. That is, if we assume that Trump is genuine, that he wants to end this war, and I think most people accept this, then there should be possible to get something done. I think the problem over the past many years is that they didn't actually have a partner on the other side. Now they do see that they have one, but there's still some concerns because if it was just up to Trump, I think there would be more reason to be optimistic. But at the same time, you have the rest of the American political establishment. You have Zelensky. Of course, he could be pushed aside. But then you also have the Europeans. Keep in mind when the Russians and Americans are talking about ending the war, you have the Europeans literally in panic. You have the British Prime Minister Starmer talking about putting together a coalition of the willing to send troops on the ground and really hyping the Russian fear. So it's some concerns whether or not this can actually be pulled off. And so again, this is where the optimism comes from. The pessimism is that Russia's been seen as having betrayed in the past. Keep in mind that already from 1990, we actually signed agreements, that is the Charter of Paris for a New Europe with the Russians, actually the Soviets at that time. But we built on this as well. We had agreements about having a Europe without dividing lines, indivisible security, effectively building on the idea of a common Europe. All of this was betrayed, they see, by the decision to expand NATO, the NATO-Russia Founding Act. We weren't supposed to put troops in the new member states. Now we do. Missile defense. The EU actually made deals as well with the Russians in 2005 for under common space agreement. We're going to harmonize our positions towards the common neighborhood. Don't enhance your security or promote integration without doing it with the other side. Well, we walked away from that only a few months afterwards. Had the reset as well, as remember under the Obama administration, only to have Libya happen thereafter. We had the Minsk agreement for 7 years, and this was also betrayed. Istanbul, I mean, the list really goes on. So they have a lot of reasons why they don't trust us anymore. And I spoke actually last night to Dmitry Polyansky, the permanent representative of the Russian Federation to the United Nations. And I actually asked him the same question, and he said, do you think this is going to work out? And the main reply was simply that, well, this is an issue of existential threat, so they set out their goals. And this has to be achieved. It would be as if, telling the Americans, okay, we're just going to have Russia can only have a few missiles in Mexico and a couple of bases. There's not that much leeway on the core issues where they can actually compromise. So given that this is an existential issue, they see it in simple terms. That is, we will get this done with our military. However, if we have a partner, someone who wants to end the war and find a political solution, then of course that's much better. Imagine all the lives which could be saved. This has been really an unnecessary war. I mean, really unnecessary. If we had told the Russians 3 years ago there will be no NATO expansion, there would have been no war. Now, 3 years later, it's accepted, okay, there won't be any NATO expansion. Hundreds of thousands of deaths later on, all of this could have been avoided. So again, there's a lot of optimism and hope that things can be done with the United States, but they're not going to gamble everything on this. So there's a lack of trust, I guess. But But still, I have to point out there's also optimism. As I started off saying, they haven't seen anyone talk like Trump's talking. Again, recognizing the security concern of your opponent. It shouldn't be a revolutionary thing. This is what diplomacy would be, the first step to put yourself in the shoes of the other guy. But we haven't seen this, at least in the unipolar era. So, there's reasons for optimism.
Yep.
It is a very positive step forward, regardless of why, regardless of the agenda. It's happening. But on the one hand, a lot of viewers here are saying there's a lot of red flags already. I wanted to ask you, Larry, how much of a barrier could Trump himself pose to the possibility of a peace settlement here, given that there is this lack of trust between the two parties? Russia has been burned before, and Trump has talked a lot before. So your thoughts?
Well, the Russians are going to be watching what Trump actually does. They're not going to pay much attention to what he says because his mouth is all over the place. And everything, he's not a reliable source. And they're going to watch what he is doing, and not just doing in Ukraine, but doing around the world. So, one of the other things that we haven't talked about yet is that Trump has ordered more hell to be rained down on Yemen, and they're bombing civilian areas in Yemen. And this is one more example that the Russians are going to watch of the United States insisting that it's still this imperial hegemon who can throw its weight around the world and force others to do its will, to submit to it. And that Trump is one of the biggest cheerleaders for that. And yet Trump, in taking those positions, foolishly overestimates the capabilities of the United States to actually back up and deliver on Trump's bombast. The Russians, I think, are genuine in their optimism that they're at least getting a different tone out of Washington, D.C. I had a conversation in December 2023. I was standing next to Pepe Escobar, and we were talking to Sergei Rybkov. Rybkov is the deputy foreign minister in the foreign ministry. And back then he was saying, look, there's no contact with anybody. We don't have any kind of open diplomatic channels with the Biden administration. That condition persisted through the remainder of Biden's term. But then when Trump came in, at least they saw a rekindling of some of the fundamentals of diplomacy. So the Russians are welcoming that. They're going to work with that. They're not going to slam the door and say, get the hell out. We don't want to talk to you anymore. But they're not going to surrender their own national interests. They've, as Ray noted earlier, as Glenn has noted earlier, that there have been too many times over the last 20 years, or let's even go back to 1991, 34 years, where promises for the West have been made and betrayed. And action after action by the West to show that they have no genuine interest in a long-term security arrangement with Russia, just the opposite. The abandonment of the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2001 by George W. Bush, the 2018 abrogation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty by Donald Trump. So Russia, they're going to talk and hope that they can come up with some concrete agreements with the United States, but they're not going to accept promises. It's going to have to be very clear, well-defined actions. And Russia is hoping that it can achieve peace through that pathway. But barring that, they're going to continue the military operation until Ukraine is crushed and forced to surrender militarily.
I think, Larry, you're absolutely right here. Look, here's the reality. Russia doesn't need a ceasefire, all right? It's the last thing it needs. It's got those troops in Kursk surrounded. It's got this 2,000 kilometer line from the Donbass all the way north, going ahead gradually, attriting the Ukrainian troops. Remember, it's not about conquering territory. It's about demilitarization. That means attriting or killing off or injuring Ukrainian troops. So here's Putin. He's got no incentive to make big concessions, but he is interested in a final settlement. Now, in my view, all Trump has to do is say, Biden was from hunger. Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, these were neophytes. They know what was going on. They forgot that the Soviet Union fell apart and that they didn't want to invade Poland and the Baltic states, much less all of Ukraine. It was very simple. They felt their core interests were endangered. And Obama also said, and Trump could quote him, look, Ukraine is one of Russia's core interests. It's an existential matter for Russia. It's not an existential matter for the US, says Obama. So let's not get overextended and make commitments where it's not an existential matter. Obama said all that stuff. So all Trump used to do is say, well, Obama, even though he led this anti-Russian Russiagate stuff and do all kinds of things like throwing out our diplomats and confiscating our property and everything, at least he had the sense to look at the map, for God's sake, and realize that supporting Ukraine to weaken Russia was a fool's errand. Okay, now on the practical side, what the Russians are afraid of are hypersonic missiles, not only in Romania and Poland, which have installations prepared to accept them once the U.S. figures out how to make them. Okay, and that's inevitable. It's a wonder that it takes all, but they will. Okay, so here's what Putin told his military, his top military, on the 21st of December, 2021. Look, when the Americans get hypersonic missiles, they're not going to put them only in Ukraine and in Poland and Romania, where they already have these sites. They're going to put them in Ukraine. And guess what, military? That will leave me, Vladimir Putin, for 5 minutes to decide whether to blow up the rest of he didn't say blow up the rest of the world. What do I about to? Okay. That was the 21st of December, 2021. Now, a very curious thing happened. 9 days later, the White House gets a call from the Kremlin. President Putin would like to talk to President Biden right away, please. Well, wait a second. This is crazy. We have our negotiators meeting just in 10 days in Geneva. And besides, it's New Year's. Please, right away. Well, to his credit, Biden takes the call, but he's in Delaware without his shepherds, without his acolytes, without Biden and Sullivan, okay? And so when Putin asks him, as I think he was prompted by his military to do, look, Mr. President, we're going to meet in Geneva. We're going to finally have some talks on strategic and other weaponry. If you could just commit not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, man, that would mean the world, because that would really satisfy half of the conditions in that draft treaty. Remember that? Did they tell you about that draft? Oh, well, okay. Look it up. There is a draft treaty. It would really make things real smooth when we get to Geneva. So what happens? The readout of that call says the President of the United States agreed that he had no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. So that's the 30th of December, 2021. Great rejoicing. Ushakov, who is now coming again to the chief advisor to Putin, says, man, this is great. This is finally they're listening to us. Long story short, 21st of January, 2022 now, just a month before the special military operation, Lavrov runs down Tony Blinken. Tony, I see that you're in Geneva. So am I. Let's get together. They get together and Lavrov says, hey, how about that commitment? How about that undertaking that your president made on the 30th of December not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine? Let's go. Your negotiators there in Geneva don't seem to have any instructions on that. Blinken, forget about it. We weren't with him. He was at home alone. It was Christmas time. We have the right to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, and we're going to do it if the Ukrainians ask us. I mean, we might be willing to talk about how many to put in there, but forget about it. No deal. And during their last conversation, I think it was the 12th of February, 10 days or so before 12 days before the invasion, the last conversation between Biden and Putin, the readout said Biden refused to talk about not putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, and he also refused to talk about whether Ukraine would be allowed to come into NATO. So that's the 12th. So what I'm saying here is that the history is pretty sordid, okay? That's what the Russians are interested in. And when I talk, Larry referred to the INF treaty, a whole class of medium range, intermediate range ballistic missiles destroyed in place. Scott Ritter, our good friend, was the first inspector on the scene in this awful place called Votkhinsk. Okay, 2 years inspecting, make sure that worked. Now, what happened? It was Trump that got out of that. Okay, so there is. Lastly, I'll just say there is this really bizarre agreement that Olaf Scholz agreed that he would allow the U.S. put offensive strike missiles in Germany starting next year. So reversing completely the INF agreement. Now, when they asked him, Olaf, how'd that come about? You announced it at NATO, but it was just a bilateral agreement. What's going on here? Olaf Scholz said, well, the Americans decided to do this, and they told me about it, and I said, okay. I said, I approved it. So what could happen here is Putin could say, look, this is really crazy. Mr. Trump, you bear some of the responsibility for this misadventure. Let's get back to the INF treaty that you got out of, or something similar, an agreement, not trust, an agreement, but verifiable. And we can work that out. And I think that could be worked out. That would be something tangible, as Larry was saying, is necessary. Words don't suffice. Deeds are required.